The wedding photograph is one of the most famous images of the 20th century. The world's most admired widow standing beside one of its richest men on a private Greek island. For decades, that photograph has been sold to us as a fairy tale, a grieving woman finding safety and comfort in the arms of a devoted protector. But behind that photograph sits a marriage built on fear, financial calculation, a woman he never stopped loving on the side, and a final act of cruelty he was still planning when he died. It's a story involving stolen letters, a husband's grief turning into blame, and a battle for millions that played out only after his death. None of it fits neatly into the story most people think they already know. Stick around, because the real story of this marriage is far darker than the headlines ever let on. A friendship built from tragedy. Long before their wedding shocked the world, Jacqueline Kennedy and Aristotle Onassis had already known each other for years, moving in the same overlapping circles of wealth and power that connected Washington to the yachts and villas of the European elite, crossing paths at social gatherings and diplomatic functions on both sides of the Atlantic throughout much of the early 1960s. Their friendship deepened considerably in the fall of 1963, following one of the most painful chapters of Jacqueline's life. That August, her newborn son, Patrick, died just days after being born prematurely, a devastating loss that left the First Lady in a state of profound grief that those closest to her described as unlike anything they had witnessed from her before, even accounting for the ordinary pressures and difficulties that had already come with her years in the White House. Onassis, already acquainted with the Kennedys through mutual friends, extended an invitation for her to join him aboard his enormous private yacht for a private cruise through the Mediterranean, offering her a rare escape from the constant public scrutiny surrounding her role as First Lady, a gesture of genuine kindness during one of the most painful stretches of her adult life up to that point. Those weeks aboard his yacht reportedly gave Jacqueline something she had found almost impossible to access within the confines of the White House: a genuine sense of privacy and distance from the relentless public gaze that had followed her since the earliest days of her husband's presidency. Onassis, for his part, seemed to understand instinctively what she needed during that period, offering companionship without demanding anything in return, laying the groundwork for a friendship that would only grow more significant in the years to come. One built during a moment when Jacqueline had very few people in her life capable of offering that same combination of genuine warmth and total discretion. Just months later, in November of 1963, tragedy struck again in the most violent and public way imaginable, when President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The images of Jacqueline at his funeral, composed and dignified despite unimaginable grief, became some of the defining photographs of the entire decade, cementing her place in the American public imagination as a figure of extraordinary strength in the face of devastating loss. Images that would be reprinted and revisited so many times over the following years that they became almost inseparable from the broader mythology surrounding the Kennedy family itself. In the years that followed, Onassis remained a quiet, steady presence in her life, someone who could offer both genuine friendship and a level of privacy and protection that had become almost impossible for her to find anywhere else, given the relentless attention that continued to follow her every public appearance. Then, in June of 1968, disaster struck the Kennedy family once again. Robert Kennedy, John's younger brother, and someone Jacqueline had leaned on heavily since her husband's death, was assassinated in Los Angeles while campaigning for president, gunned down in the kitchen pantry of a hotel just moments after declaring victory in the California primary. For Jacqueline, the loss was shattering in an entirely new way, confirming a fear that had apparently been building inside her for years. She reportedly confided to friends around this time that she believed her family was being systematically targeted, and that her own children, as Kennedys, might not be safe either. A fear rooted not in paranoia, but in an unbearably real pattern that had already claimed her husband and was now claiming his brother as well. That fear was reportedly compounded by the reality of her own security situation, since she and her children each had only a single Secret Service protection officer at their disposal, a level of protection that must have felt entirely inadequate given everything her family had already endured over the preceding 5 years, particularly in an era when any photographer approaching her in public could, in theory, just as easily have been someone with far more dangerous intentions. It was against this backdrop of accumulated, genuine terror that she made the decision, just 4 months after Bobby's death, to marry Aristotle Onassis, a man whose extraordinary wealth could buy something that grief alone could never provide: real, tangible security. Some biographers who have studied this period of her life closely have suggested that the sheer speed of her decision, moving from mourning her brother-in-law to marrying one of the wealthiest men in the world in under half a year, only makes sense when viewed through the lens of a woman acting out of genuine, well-founded fear rather than romantic impulse. A decision made not out of any sudden infatuation, but out of a hard, practical calculation about what her family actually needed to survive the years ahead. But what actually went into arranging that marriage revealed just how far removed from a simple love story this union truly was from the very beginning. A marriage negotiated like a business deal. Rather than a straightforward romantic engagement, the marriage between Jacqueline and Onassis was reportedly built around an extraordinarily detailed prenuptial agreement, one that biographers have since described as containing somewhere between 170 and 173 separate clauses. A document reportedly drafted over the course of extensive negotiations between lawyers representing both sides in the months leading up to the wedding itself. This was not a simple financial arrangement protecting each partner's individual wealth. It was a comprehensive contract governing nearly every conceivable aspect of their married life together, reportedly including provisions addressing how much time the couple would be expected to spend together, detailed financial terms covering what would happen in the event of a divorce initiated by either party, and perhaps most tellingly of all, extensive guarantees regarding Jacqueline's physical security and that of her 2 children. The sheer scope and specificity of the document stood in remarkable contrast to how most people, then or now, imagine the beginning of a marriage, reading less like a declaration of love and considerably more like a carefully negotiated corporate merger between two parties, each protecting their own interests. That security provision wasn't a minor detail buried deep within the contract. According to those familiar with the negotiations, it represented one of the single most important conditions of the entire marriage for Jacqueline, a non-negotiable requirement given everything her family had already endured. Onassis agreed to provide around-the-clock protection for Jacqueline and her children for the remainder of their lives, transforming what might have otherwise looked like an unusual and calculating business arrangement into something closer to a desperate, carefully negotiated shield against a world that had already proven itself capable of shattering her life not once, but twice. For a woman who had already lost a husband to an assassin's bullet and watched her brother-in-law suffer the exact same fate just months earlier, the promise of genuine, well-funded protection likely mattered to her every bit as much as any romantic feelings she may or may not have held for her new husband. And by most accounts, Onassis genuinely delivered on that particular promise, ensuring his wife and stepchildren received a level of physical security that few private citizens anywhere in the world could ever hope to access, regardless of how strained the emotional side of their marriage would eventually become. The financial terms were equally calculated. Should Onassis choose to end the marriage himself, Jacqueline stood to receive a reported $20 million, a figure that alone exceeded what most people could ever hope to accumulate across an entire lifetime of work. Should she be the one to walk away, she would still walk away with a substantial settlement, though a smaller one, a structure reportedly designed to discourage either party from ending the marriage impulsively, while still ensuring neither of them would face genuine financial hardship, regardless of how things eventually played out between them. And in the event of his death, the agreement guaranteed her a significant annual income for the remainder of her own life, reportedly somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 per year, along with ownership of certain properties, terms that, on paper at least, appeared to protect Jacqueline's long-term financial future, regardless of how the marriage itself ultimately unfolded. It was, in nearly every sense, a marriage negotiated the way one might negotiate a corporate merger, rather than the way most people imagine falling in love and building a life together, a detail that stood in sharp, uncomfortable contrast to the fairy tale narrative the public would soon be asked to believe. Whatever genuine affection may have existed between the two of them, and by most accounts there was at least some real fondness and mutual respect present from the very beginning, the marriage's foundational document made unmistakably clear that both parties approached the union with their eyes wide open regarding its practical, transactional dimensions, a level of calculated pragmatism that stood in almost jarring contrast to the romantic, fairy tale narrative that newspapers and magazines would spend the following years constructing around the two of them for public consumption. The wedding that shocked the world. On October 20th, 1968, Jacqueline Kennedy married Aristotle Onassis in a private ceremony on Skorpios, his own privately owned island in the Ionian Sea, a wedding conducted under heavy security and secrecy in an attempt to keep the world's press as far away from the actual ceremony as possible. The wedding sent immediate shockwaves through American society, transforming the widow of a beloved assassinated president into the wife of a controversial 23 years older foreign businessman almost overnight. Many Americans reacted with genuine dismay, feeling that the marriage somehow tarnished the sacred memory of President Kennedy, while others were simply captivated by the sheer scale of wealth and mystery surrounding her new husband, a man whose private island, private yacht, and vast shipping fortune stood in almost surreal contrast to the humble public service image so closely associated with the Kennedy family name. Newspapers ran extensive coverage speculating about every conceivable detail of the union, from the size of the engagement ring to the exact nature of Onassis's fortune, feeding a public appetite for information about a man most Americans had known almost nothing about just weeks earlier. And gossip columnists spent months attempting to reconstruct exactly how and when the relationship between Jacqueline and Onassis had first turned romantic, piecing together a timeline from second-hand accounts and speculation, since neither party ever offered the press a detailed account of their own. The marriage also created uncomfortable friction with the Catholic Church, since Onassis had been divorced and his first wife, Tina, was still living at the time of the wedding, raising genuine questions about whether Jacqueline might face consequences within her own faith for entering into the union, a concern that mattered enormously to a woman who had been raised within a devout Catholic family and who continued identifying closely with that faith throughout the rest of her life, and one that generated its own separate wave of speculative newspaper coverage in the weeks surrounding the wedding. Those concerns were eventually set aside by church officials, but the controversy surrounding the union never fully faded, and Jacqueline quickly found herself the target of relentless, invasive media attention, earning her the now famous nickname Jackie O, a label that would follow her for the rest of her life. Photographers hounded her constantly in the years that followed, and one particularly aggressive photographer became so notorious for his pursuit of her that Jacqueline was eventually granted a restraining order against him. a stark illustration of just how invasive the public fascination with her new life had become almost immediately after the wedding itself, transforming even routine errands and outings into carefully choreographed evasions of the cameras that never seemed to leave her alone, a level of scrutiny that arguably exceeded even what she had experienced during her years as First Lady, when at least some portion of the public attention had been directed at her husband's role rather than almost entirely at her. What almost no one watching the ceremony that day could have known was that the very man she had just entrusted with her safety and her future had never actually let go of the woman he had loved for the better part of a decade before Jacqueline ever entered his life, a private reality that stood in complete contradiction to the image of a devoted new husband that the wedding photographs seemed to promise the watching world. The woman he never truly left. Years before he ever met Jacqueline, Onassis had begun a passionate and highly publicized affair with the celebrated opera singer Maria Callas, beginning in 1959 when both of them were still married to other people, having crossed paths during a lavish cruise aboard his yacht that summer. A voyage that also happened to include guests such as Winston Churchill among its extraordinary passenger list, one of the most talked about social gatherings of the entire decade. Their relationship continued for years afterward, becoming one of the most talked about romances in Europe, a pairing between one of the world's wealthiest men and one of its most celebrated performers, one that had captivated European tabloids for the better part of a decade before Jacqueline ever entered the picture, generating headlines across the continent every time the two of them were spotted together at the opera houses, casinos, and private parties that defined their shared social world. When Onassis married Jacqueline in 1968, the public understanding was that his relationship with Callas had run its course, a natural conclusion given that he was now formally committing himself to an entirely different and considerably more famous woman. The private reality, according to multiple biographers who have since examined the marriage closely, was something else entirely. According to accounts drawn from people close to both Onassis and Callas at the time, he resumed visiting the opera singer not long after returning from his honeymoon with Jacqueline, quietly slipping back into contact with the woman he had never truly stopped loving, in some cases reportedly within mere weeks of his wedding to Jacqueline. Onassis reportedly made little effort to keep the connection entirely secret from those in his own social circle, effectively flaunting the ongoing relationship in ways that made his continued devotion to Callas an open secret among the people who knew him best, even as his new wife maintained her own public composure and continued appearing alongside him at official functions and society events, greeting guests and posing for photographs as though nothing at all were amiss beneath the surface of their carefully maintained public partnership. When Jacqueline's friend, singer Carly Simon, later wrote about their friendship, she described the emotional toll of watching Jacqueline endure this ongoing infidelity, on top of everything else the marriage would eventually demand of her, painting a portrait of a woman forced to project serenity to the outside world, while quietly absorbing yet another painful betrayal within her own home. A pattern of public grace, masking private pain, that had, by that point in her life, become almost a defining feature of how she navigated every difficult chapter the world threw at her. It's worth noting that Onassis's devotion to Callas bordered on obsessive in its own right. Years later, after Onassis's health had begun to decline and his marriage to Jacqueline had grown deeply strained, he reportedly showed up at Callas's residence in Paris, only to be turned away at first. Rather than simply leaving, he stood outside, whistling up toward her window in an attempt to get her attention, behavior more befitting a heartbroken young suitor than one of the most powerful and controlled businessmen in the entire world, and on at least one occasion reportedly threatened to drive his car straight through her front door if she continued to refuse to see him, behavior that would have seemed startling and erratic from any man, let alone one of the wealthiest and most powerful businessmen in the entire world. It paints a picture of a man whose emotional loyalty had never actually shifted toward the wife the world believed he had married for love, a dynamic that would only grow more complicated and more painful as an entirely separate scandal from Jacqueline's own past suddenly resurfaced, adding yet another layer of strain to a marriage that was already buckling under the weight of divided loyalty. A scandal from her past resurfaces. In February of 1970, roughly a year and a half into her marriage to Onassis, a set of deeply personal letters written by Jacqueline suddenly and mysteriously surfaced at a public auction, catching both her own representatives and much of the watching public entirely off guard. The letters had been written years earlier to Roswell Gilpatrick, a former Deputy Secretary of Defense with whom Jacqueline had reportedly maintained a romantic connection during an earlier period of her life, well before her marriage to Onassis had ever been formally announced to the public. One of the letters had actually been written from aboard Onassis's own yacht, in which Jacqueline explained to Gilpatrick why she hadn't yet told him about her plans to marry Onassis, an intimate and revealing piece of correspondence never intended for public consumption, let alone for the kind of widespread press coverage the auction quickly generated. The sudden, unexplained appearance of those letters at auction, rather than remaining in private hands, struck many observers at the time as far too convenient to be entirely coincidental, raising uncomfortable questions about who might have benefited from making them public and why, particularly given the timing, arriving at a moment when public fascination with Jacqueline's private life remained at an absolute fever pitch. Speculation swirled for years afterward about the true source of the leak, with some wondering whether the letters had been deliberately released to embarrass Jacqueline, to damage her standing within her new marriage, or simply to profit from the seemingly bottomless public appetite for anything connected to her private life. Others speculated that the timing may have been connected to broader tensions already simmering within the marriage itself, though no definitive explanation for exactly how the letters made their way from private correspondence to a public auction house has ever been fully confirmed, leaving the entire episode as one of the more persistently unresolved mysteries connected to Jacqueline's years as Onassis's wife. Whatever the true explanation behind their surfacing, the timing added yet another layer of humiliation and scrutiny to a marriage that was already carrying far more private strain than the glossy magazine photographs ever suggested, forcing Jacqueline to publicly weather yet another deeply personal violation of her privacy, despite having already endured so many others throughout the preceding decade. And within just a few years, an entirely different kind of devastation would arrive, one that would fundamentally and permanently poison whatever remained of the relationship between Jacqueline and her husband. Tragedy turns him against her. In January of 1973, Onassis's only son and intended heir, Alexander, was involved in a catastrophic plane crash at Athens airport, suffering severe injuries while practicing takeoffs and landings in a small aircraft. An aircraft that, by many accounts, had been checked out for a routine training flight that was never meant to carry any real danger at all. He died from those injuries the following day, at just 24 years old, a devastating loss that shattered Onassis in ways from which those closest to him say he never fully recovered. A young man who had been widely expected to eventually inherit and run his father's vast shipping empire, and whose sudden death effectively erased the future Onassis had spent decades building toward. A lifetime of accumulated wealth and business empire building suddenly left without the intended heir who was meant to carry it all forward into the next generation. Rather than turning to his wife for comfort during this unbearable period of grief, Onassis's mourning curdled into something far darker and more disturbing, and he began directing his pain and anger squarely at Jacqueline herself, a reaction that stunned and deeply hurt the people around him who had hoped his marriage might offer him genuine support during the worst tragedy of his life. According to multiple biographers who have examined this period of the marriage closely, Onassis began telling friends and associates that his wife had somehow brought misfortune into his life. At one point, reportedly referring to her as a witch and insisting to those around him that she carried some kind of curse, an accusation his own advisors and business associates reportedly found genuinely alarming, coming from a man normally known for his hard-nosed rationality in nearly every other area of his life. It was an irrational, deeply wounding accusation, one seemingly born entirely out of grief rather than any genuine belief in the supernatural. But it marked a clear and permanent turning point in how Onassis treated his wife for the remainder of their marriage. Where he had once been generous and protective, he grew colder, more resentful, and increasingly determined to distance himself from her entirely, even as the two remained legally and publicly married, maintaining the appearance of a functioning union for the benefit of the outside world. While privately, the relationship had already begun collapsing under the weight of his grief and his growing bitterness, a private unraveling that the carefully managed public image of the marriage worked hard to keep entirely hidden from view. Financially, that shift became noticeable as well. Onassis reportedly provided Jacqueline with a monthly allowance in the tens of thousands of dollars, but as tensions between them deepened, he grew increasingly frustrated with what he viewed as her extravagant spending habits. At one point, reportedly cutting her allowance by roughly a third in an apparent effort to rein in her expenses and assert greater control over the marriage. It was a small, telling detail within a much larger pattern. A husband who had once promised lifelong protection, now using money as a tool to punish and control the very woman that protection had been meant to secure. A shift that friends of the couple reportedly noticed and found genuinely troubling, given how differently Onassis had once treated his new wife during the earlier, happier years of their marriage, back when generosity rather than punishment had defined so much of how he expressed his feelings toward her. The divorce he never got to finish. As his health began to seriously decline in the years following Alexander's death, Onassis grew increasingly bitter and increasingly determined to formally end his marriage to Jacqueline, driven, according to biographer Ariana Stasinopoulos' account of Maria Callas's life, by a growing sense that marrying Jacqueline had ultimately been a betrayal of the woman he had always truly loved. He reportedly hired a private investigator specifically tasked with following Jacqueline in hopes of gathering evidence of infidelity that could be used against her in divorce proceedings. And he retained a notoriously aggressive New York attorney named Roy Cohn, a lawyer already well known for his ruthless, take-no-prisoners approach to legal disputes and for representing some of the most controversial and high-profile clients in the country throughout his career, to begin formally drafting the paperwork, a choice of counsel that itself signaled just how aggressively Onassis intended to approach the coming legal battle. According to Stasinopoulos' account, Onassis made his intentions chillingly clear to Cohn, expressing a desire not simply to end the marriage, but to ensure the divorce proceedings would be made as humiliating and painful for Jacqueline as legally possible, a directive that left even his own attorney reportedly taken aback by the sheer intensity of the resentment driving the request. It stands as one of the most disturbing revelations to emerge from the entire marriage. A husband who had once positioned himself as his wife's protector, now actively working to inflict maximum public and financial damage on her before their union could even be formally dissolved. A plan that, had he lived long enough to carry it out, would have almost certainly generated one of the most sensational and damaging divorce proceedings of the entire decade, dragging Jacqueline's private life back into exactly the kind of merciless public spectacle that the marriage's original security provisions had been meant to help her escape from in the first place. Onassis never got the chance to see that plan through. He had been diagnosed with myasthenia gravis, a serious autoimmune disorder that caused progressive muscle weakness, a condition that had already begun visibly affecting his once formidable physical presence in the years following Alexander's death, contributing to a broader decline that those around him described as both physically and emotionally devastating to witness. A man once known for his commanding presence in any room, now visibly struggling with even basic physical tasks. The condition grew severe enough that in his final months, doctors reportedly had to tape his eyelids open simply so he could keep his eyes visibly functioning, a stark and almost unbearably vivid symbol of just how far his once formidable physical presence had deteriorated by that point. He travelled to Paris for treatment, choosing to remain close to Maria Callas throughout his final weeks rather than to his own wife. A final, telling choice about where his true loyalty had remained all along. Aristotle Onassis died on March 15th, 1975, at the American Hospital in Paris, at the age of 69, leaving behind a will that had already been quietly revised to reduce Jacqueline's inheritance, along with a legal battle over his fortune that his own daughter would soon inherit and continue waging on his behalf. The battle for the fortune. Following Onassis's death, his surviving daughter, Christina, inherited the overwhelming majority of his vast shipping fortune, and she wasted little time moving to limit exactly how much Jacqueline could ultimately claim under the terms of their original prenuptial agreement, retaining her own team of lawyers to scrutinize every clause of the document her father had once negotiated so carefully. What followed was a drawn-out and deeply contentious legal battle that stretched on for roughly 2 years, pitting the widow of one of the most beloved American presidents in history against the sole surviving heir of one of the wealthiest men in the world, playing out largely behind closed doors, but generating persistent public speculation throughout its duration, as journalists and biographers alike tried to piece together exactly how much money was actually at stake and how the negotiations between the two women were unfolding. Christina had reportedly never fully warmed to Jacqueline throughout the entire marriage, and neither had Alexander before his death, viewing their father's second wife with a degree of suspicion and resentment that only intensified once she stood between Christina and full, uncontested control over her father's fortune. A dynamic that reportedly made even routine family gatherings during Onassis's lifetime noticeably tense and difficult for everyone involved, with staff members who worked within the household later describing an atmosphere of barely concealed hostility whenever Jacqueline and her stepchildren found themselves in the same room together. That underlying tension shaped much of the legal battle that followed, with both sides digging in over the exact interpretation of a prenuptial agreement that had, ironically, been designed years earlier specifically to prevent this kind of prolonged and public conflict from ever taking place. A document meant to provide clarity that instead became the very battleground over which the two women fought for 2 exhausting years. In 1977, the two sides finally reached a settlement. Jacqueline agreed to accept a reported $26 million, formally waiving any further claims to the remainder of the Onassis estate. It was a substantial sum by almost any measure, but notably far smaller than the vast majority of her late husband's overall fortune, and considerably less than what she might have received had Onassis not spent his final months actively working to reduce her inheritance out of bitterness and grief. A final financial consequence of a marriage that had turned considerably darker in its closing years than the wedding photographs from 1968 could have ever suggested. Jacqueline's own public statement following his death had been notably careful and measured, describing him as someone who had rescued her during a period when her life felt engulfed by shadows, language that, in hindsight, revealed remarkably little about the genuine turbulence that had defined so much of their 7 years together. A carefully composed public face that had, by that point, become something close to second nature for a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades of her adult life under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable. choosing her words with the same deliberate precision she had once used to navigate the aftermath of her first husband's assassination. In the years that followed, Jacqueline turned to a Belgian-American diamond merchant named Maurice Templesman to help manage and grow her settlement. And by most accounts, he succeeded remarkably well, reportedly multiplying her original inheritance several times over across the following decade through careful investment, transforming what had already been a substantial settlement into a genuinely significant personal fortune, entirely independent of anything connected to either of her two marriages. Templesman would go on to become her closest and most enduring companion for the remainder of her life, a quiet, steady presence that stood in sharp contrast to the volatility and hidden cruelty that had ultimately come to define her marriage to Onassis, offering her, at long last, something resembling the genuine stability and partnership that had eluded her throughout both of her marriages, a relationship built on trust and consistency rather than the calculated transactions and hidden betrayals that had defined so much of her previous romantic life. A legacy reconsidered. Looking back across the entirety of Jacqueline and Aristotle Onassis's marriage, the picture that emerges is considerably more troubling than the glamorous, protective fairy tale the public was originally sold back in 1968. A union initially built around genuine, desperate fear for her children's safety. A cold, meticulously negotiated business contract, standing in for anything resembling traditional romance. A husband who never actually let go of another woman, even as he publicly presented himself as a devoted new spouse. A stolen set of deeply personal letters resurfacing at exactly the moment they could cause the most damage. A devastating family tragedy that curdled into irrational cruelty directed squarely at his own wife. And finally, a husband actively plotting to make his wife's eventual divorce as humiliating as legally possible, right up until his own declining health made that plan impossible to complete. None of this necessarily erases whatever genuine comfort or friendship Jacqueline and Onassis found in each other during the better years of their relationship, particularly in those earlier years following the devastating losses of both her husband and her brother-in-law, when his presence and his protection likely did offer her something she couldn't find anywhere else in the world at that particular moment in her life. Biographers who have studied the marriage closely generally agree that the earliest years, before Alexander's death fundamentally poisoned Onassis's outlook, likely did contain genuine warmth and mutual respect between the two of them, even if that warmth was always layered on top of a foundation built more on practical necessity than sweeping romantic passion. The kind of steady companionship that can grow between two people who genuinely understand and respect what the other has already survived. But the fuller picture, the one involving hidden infidelity, calculated financial punishment, and a plan for deliberate humiliation, tells a far more disturbing story than the one that has been repeated in magazines and documentaries for decades. A reminder that even the most photographed, most celebrated marriages of the 20th century can carry secrets considerably darker than anyone watching from the outside was ever meant to see. It's a version of events that complicates, without necessarily erasing entirely, the popular image of Onassis as Jacqueline's devoted rescuer, revealing instead a far more complex and, at times, genuinely disturbing portrait of a man capable of both real generosity and real cruelty toward the same woman, sometimes within the very same year, a contradiction that says as much about the corrosive effects of grief and power as it does about either individual person involved. Decades later, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis remains one of the most admired and closely studied women of her generation, remembered for her poise, her intelligence, and her remarkable resilience in the face of tragedy after tragedy. But the fuller story of her second marriage, once the fairy tale narrative is finally set aside, reveals a woman who survived yet another deeply difficult chapter of her extraordinary life. this time hidden almost entirely behind the glittering surface of one of the most photographed unions in modern history. A private struggle she carried with the same quiet, composed dignity that had defined nearly every other public hardship she had already endured throughout her remarkable and closely watched life. Historians and biographers continue revisiting this particular chapter of her story precisely because it complicates the two competing narratives that have long dominated the public's understanding of her second marriage. Neither the simple fairy tale of rescue, nor a purely cynical story of two people using each other, but something considerably messier and more human, sitting somewhere in between those two extremes. A nuance that each new generation of writers seems determined to rediscover for itself, regardless of how many times the story has already been told before. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.